A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
One of those conversations you'll probably want to lean in just a little closer to your radio over this coming hour. Some really challenging things to talk about. And one of the challenging things of late, and you might think this is important, you might think it's not, but one of those big challenging things is the way that some voices want to convince us that modern Australia and our colonial history are all bad. Well, an opportunity today to identify and celebrate what is best about Australian culture and for all of its sins, framing the argument of why our freedom, prosperity and flourishing as a nation need to be protected. A new book called The Culture of Freedom traces the origins and unique nature of Western culture. It identifies the increasingly dangerous worlds where not only are there enemies without, but also enemies within. The book's author is Dr Kevin Donnelly. He says we've got a lot to defend. Things like our parliamentary and legal system, ensuring liberty and freedom. Our education system, which is intellectually rigorous, morally grounded, and emotionally and spiritually enriching. Or our Judeo-Christian inspired morality and virtues. Dr Kevin Donnelly is one of Australia's leading conservative public intellectuals. He is a senior research fellow at the Australian Catholic University and the director of the Education Standards Institute. And always a pleasure to welcome back to 2020 Dr Kevin Donnelly. Welcome, Kevin.
Can you hear me now?
I've got you, yes.
Even better.
Hey, Kevin, you say forgetting the influences that made us is a little bit like having a national dementia. An interesting way of framing a thought here on our national values and what's important. How do you reflect on a national dementia?
Well, the idea came to me. We've all, unfortunately, experienced a loved one or a relative who has dementia for whatever reason. And it's quite distressing, obviously, and very misfortunate. But what I've been doing over the last few years is looking more broadly at Australian society or our culture. Now, T.S. Eliot talks about culture as a way of life. Other people talk about culture in terms of literature, music, art, religion, most importantly. Also our political legal institutions. If you look at a nation's culture, it doesn't just arise accidentally or people just don't wake up one morning and understand it or acknowledge it or appreciate it. Culture has to be passed on from generation to generation. And I write a lot about Western culture because nobody can deny the fact that Australia, United Kingdom, Europe, America, Canada, New Zealand, to name a few, we're all part of Western culture. Now, I talk about what other people call the great forgetting, This like a dementia that happens with a culture when you no longer pass on to young people why that culture is so vital. And so we've reached that stage in the West, especially in Australia. Over the last 20 years, I'd say 30 years, there's been this gradual movement, this what I call cultural Marxist movement to cancel our culture.
So when we think of this dementia, a national dementia, a little bit like, as you say, a husband or a wife losing the memories that define them as a person. And so if we're able to recapture those memories, there's a different direction in the redefining. It's the different way we can shape the future from this point forward. But somehow or other, you've got to have a turning point, haven't you?
You do, and I'm sure your listeners would know Edmund Burke, the famous British politician and author of, he after the French Revolution all those years ago, he wrote about that. And one of the things that Burke says is that if you're a conservative, which I am, especially a Christian, what we have to acknowledge is our responsibility to pass on what is best about the past to our current generation so that they have a better understanding and a better way of coping with the future. So religion is an obvious example. Christianity underpins and nourishes our way of life and our institutions. So if that's not passed on, we're in all kinds of trouble. And we only have to look around Australia at the moment to see the outcome. Too many young people are depressed, anxious, feel that there's nothing to hold on to. So it's very important to understand that this cultural patrimony or cultural heritage, most importantly, has to be taught either by family, by church, or by schools and universities.
So you've got this reinventing that's going on now, and I might ask you about the sorts of voices that are about this revision or reinventing these cultural values. Just to remind listeners that you were co-head of a review into the national school curriculum some years ago, commissioned by former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. And in today's curriculum, I know you've got some criticisms where there are different voices that are in the curriculum that are educating our children in schools. One of those being a voice for Aboriginal culture and history and spirituality. Give us your thoughts about the other voices that are in the mix right now.
The problem with the national curriculum, and it's also evident the way the different states and territories implement that curriculum. There are literally hundreds of references to Aboriginal culture, history, spirituality. A handful, and this is kindergarten or prep to year 10, in every subject, history, English, whatever it might be. There are hundreds of references to Aboriginal culture, history, and only a handful, I think I counted 5, about Christianity. Now, that is the imbalance is so great. And the reason that's happened, as many of us would realise, many of your listeners, we're now living in a very, what some call an absolutist, secular society. And I trace that back to cultural Marxism, which arose during the 1920s and 30s. But we're living in a time where those who control our schools and universities have been very successful in taking the long march, as it's often called, and taking control of education in particular. So when you look at the national curriculum, it always talks about slavery as England, America. They never mention that if you go back in time to the Caliphate, to Islam around the Mediterranean, they were shocking in terms of slavery, the same as African tribes were. Nobody is taught that it was Wilberforce and the Christians in England all those years ago who worked to get legislation to ban slavery, and that's what England did. And more to the point, they sent out their navy to actually stop the slave trade. That's only one example of how we're not giving young people a balanced and insightful understanding of our culture.
So we'll often demonise our colonial heritage because somehow or other these other voices are growing loud. We've got to be able to defend the colonial heritage and the good things that came from it. Undoubtedly, there were some challenging things too in the early years, and some people will argue, well, there was disease and those sorts of things too that came with the First Fleet. But the good things we're talking about here are the things that shape a culture that can be a culture which is, harmonious and flourishing and thriving. Those sorts of things that you need to reinforce, Kevin.
Well, it's never taught in schools or universities, but two of the most important books that arrived with the First Fleet were the King James Bible and Blackstone's Laws of England. It's only because of those two books that we are as we are today. And as you're probably aware, the French arrived in Botany Bay a week or two after Philip. And if it wasn't for the English, Philip went to Sydney Cove and raised the flag. If it wasn't for the English, we'd probably be talking French. But those two books, King James Bible and Blackstone's Laws of England, underpin our way of life, our institutions. And when you look at the orders given to Philip by the Admiralty, he was told to coexist, be friendly with the natives that he encountered. And in fact, he was speared on one occasion and didn't take any retribution. And he said himself, this would be a colony, a new part of the British Empire. There would be no slavery. And so, of course, there were crimes committed. The Mile Creek Massacre is one of them. But those white men were eventually tried, and some were, well, they were hung. So it's a very positive story, but we never teach that to our young people.
You quote an author named Paul Morrissey in an article, and no doubt this is a quote that's in your book as well. Let me read the quote and get you to enlarge on it, because as I'm hearing you reflect on those two books arriving on our shores, the King James Bible and Blackstone's Laws of England, Paul Morrissey argues about Western culture. He says it's a way of worship, a codified morality, and a belief in the inherent dignity of all as created in the image and likeness of one true God. He actually says in that one sentence, I think, what sums up those two books, what the values that they brought to our shores. Any thoughts here on how we need to rediscover those?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent chapter. It's chapter 1 in the book, The Culture of Freedom. And he makes the point, obviously, as you've alluded to, that what we've inherited goes back to ancient Rome, to ancient Greece, to the New and Old Testaments, to the preachings of Jesus, the Christ. And that's something which can't be denied. I mean, no matter how much secular activists or driven by cultural Marxism want to deny that, it's inescapable that that's what we are as a culture. Now, how do we confront this? Well, you would hope that whatever government wins federally next year, that they take this up, because I think more and more parents, more and more teachers are starting to think enough is enough. And when you look at the 60-40 vote against the Indigenous voice to Parliament, one of the reasons there is that people were fed up with this identity politics, victimhood, the argument that we were invaded, that Aborigines were invaded, that we committed, the white people committed suicide. That we're reaching a tipping point here. So I think government will have to realise that. The other thing, and it's very positive, over the last 3 years I've organised forums in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, and the last one was in Brisbane this year, where we had over 90 people register, parents, teachers. They're starting their own schools. Now, a lot of them are Christian schools. They might be in Toowoomba or Adelaide or Perth or Melbourne or Sydney or Wagga. They're Catholic schools. But a lot of parents in particular are saying we must get back to, as you mentioned, an education which is intellectually rigorous, morally grounded, and emotionally and spiritually enriching. And these schools are adopting a classical, liberal approach, similar to America. And in America, there are over 500 of these schools have started over the last few years. And homeschooling is another thing. So in many ways, I think parents are starting to act. And I think that's very beneficial, lighting small fires, which I hope will grow.
And it's parents acting defensively here because they can recognise the threat. We're going to come back and continue our conversation, and you might have your own thoughts on what might be happening. Is there an education revolution that could take place in your own community? Are you the sort of person who might even lead something like that in your own community? You might like to respond to our conversation today with a thought or two on who or what shapes a national culture. And we might say who or what is shaping our national culture right now. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. Our special guest this hour is Dr Kevin Donnelly, one of Australia's leading conservative public intellectuals. And no doubt he'd love to field a question or two that you might have around the issues we're talking about today. 1-800-316-316 as we're talking about Kevin's new book called The Culture of Freedom. You can get a hold of that visiting Kevin's website, kevindonnelly.com.au. Back with more in a moment. Kevin, if I'm asking you if you can identify the enemy, as you say, the enemy without, the enemy within, perhaps listeners might like to know which groups you're talking about, because sometimes the enemy is there, but we're not actually seeing clearly who the enemy is. Have you got some thoughts here?
When you look at outside of Australia, obviously China, Xi Jinping, Russia with Putin, North Korea, we're very much aware increasingly that the international scene is fraught with danger. But we also have to look within our own culture. And what we have to see there is that the enemy within is just as dangerous as the enemy without. And when I talk about cultural Marxism, it goes back to the Frankfurt School in Germany during the 1920s and 1930s, where a group of academics became very influential around the world, America, England, Australia. They saw that the communist revolution was never going to be successful in Western countries. And so what they decided was to shift from trying to take to the streets, storm the barricades. What they decided was to take what Rudi Dutschke, a German socialist, called the Long March through the institutions. And there are a number of people behind this, academics. I won't go into it, but we do talk about it in the book. But these academics became very influential. And during the 1960s in particular, there was the rise of what they call critical theory, gender theory, feminism, deconstruction, post-colonial, all of these different things that most of us don't know about. But the danger is they've all radically changed what is happening in schools and universities. That is why at universities, in history, students are taught, for example, that there's nothing beneficial about in the Enlightenment. There's nothing beneficial about our mathematics or our science, Western mathematics or science. In the national curriculum, it actually talks about students studying Aboriginal algebra, which I never knew existed. So all of these theories, even though we often are not aware of them, they're the theories that have led to the situation now, as I said, where in kindergarten, schools, primary, secondary, children as young as 6 and 7 are taught that boys can be girls, girls can be boys, and that it's their choice. It's not God-given, it's not biological. And they're also taught that there's nothing of value in Australian society. They should feel guilty. And again, I'll finish by going back to Lenin. He and others, including Antonioni Gramsci, argued that communism would be the religion to take over from Christianity. So if you go back to the 1920s, 1930s, the Italian Antonioni Gramsci was very clear that socialism, whether you call it communism or not, would be the new religion to destroy Christianity. And Lenin, who was obviously responsible for the Russian Revolution, argued, clearly stating there is no morality There is no morality. You can do whatever you want to achieve the worker's paradise. So what we have underpinning this is a very nihilistic, destructive, anti-Christian philosophy. And we only have to see the outcome now to realise how powerful it is.
We'll take some calls in just a moment, but just to pause and reflect here for a moment, because I always love the evidence. What are those things that cause us to have substance in our faith and our culture and our nation? And when you start to talk about people can do anything, and you know what? That's something that we are seeing left, right and centre of everything that's going on, people having this freedom. And this is the various groups, the different identities rising up to push their own barrow. But I can't help but come back and reflect just for a moment on the 8th commandment. You know, we've talked about 10 commandments. The 8th commandment says, "Thou shalt not steal." And oftentimes we're cautious and we like to think, oh, isn't that just about some things like petty theft? And we teach our kids, "Thou shalt not steal," and get a slap on the wrist. But that commandment, so powerful, and I'll get a brief thought from you here, Kevin, but that's the commandment that gives Western civilization our foundation for our rights of property ownership and personal autonomy. The fact that we can own our own bodies, the security for our marriages because we don't want someone coming to steal our spouse, the integrity over exploitation in the workplace, our consumer rights and trustworthy trade agreements, our payment systems. That is so powerful as a foundation for Western culture, and yet there are so many quick to just brush it away and say it doesn't matter. A thought or two from you on the sorts of things that we talk about as a Judeo-Christian foundation?
I'm sure many of you would be aware, your listeners, of Augusto Zimmermann, who's an academic in Perth, writes a lot about the law, and he, in a number of books, traces all of what you've spoken about back to England during the 16th, 17th century, even earlier. And what happened with the legal system was that the argument was that the monarchy could never be above the people because God was above the monarch. And the monarch was there to actually safeguard the people. And given that all people, all citizens, have that inherent God-given right to what the American Declaration calls life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, that in England, that became codified in a common law system where you could vote, you could not be put in jail without good reason, habeas corpus. You could enter contracts realising that people had to comply or else there would be legal proceedings. Augusto Zimmermann makes the point that our political and our legal systems originated with the New Testament in particular. And there's a very good book, The Origins of Liberalism, by Larry Seidentrop, where he traces this back to the New Testament as well, and the impact that had, especially on ancient Rome, where eventually Christianity had such an impact in terms of fundamentally changing the culture and the society. So all of the things that, for example, are in the United Nations Declaration of Independence, the American Declaration, if you look at even the Australian Constitution, the preamble talks about humbly relying on Almighty God. All of this stems from, as I say, and you've mentioned, the New Testament. And that's one of the reasons we wrote the book, Defend the West, the Culture of Freedom. And there are 10 chapters. Augusto has written one. And what we want to give readers is something positive and worthwhile by explaining the danger we're now in. And I'm reminded of the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis. Even in the modern world, there is a devil, there is evil. So in the book, we're saying to people, be aware of the danger, be aware of what can be done to overcome that and to hopefully prosper as we should.
And we're greatly encouraged that our faith is not flaky, but it has real substance, and it's the foundation for what we're talking about defending today. 1-800-316-316 to join our conversation. Let's take some calls. Jamie is in Killarney in Queensland. Hey, Jamie, welcome.
Hi, g'day. How are you today?
Very good, Jamie. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, good. Well, I've been thinking deeply about all these things, particularly since the 2016 vote on gay marriage, obviously, and I've sort of noticed the white ant treatment that you were speaking of earlier. But one of the things that I picked up on just recently, and I thought a lot about, was I noticed that Kevin mentioned things like environmentalism, land rights for Aborigines and feminism. And it was those three items itself that I had deep thoughts on. I thought, all of those areas we cannot be forgiven for because we're born into an industrial age. Well, it doesn't matter how hard we try, it doesn't matter how much recycling we do, we can never be forgiven for destroying the environment. We can never be forgiven as white people for taking the land wrongly off the Aborigines. And also, when you're a male, you can never be forgiven for being born a male. So you're expected to be not too competitive and, to make it fairer for females and so forth. And I think about that in light of my faith, that God forgives us our sins. But with this sort of new restructuring, Marxist-style socialism type society, we're always to be blamed and we can never be forgiven. And I just thought that was interesting within itself.
Jamie, you're raising a very important point here, and let's seek a thought or two from our guest, Dr Kevin Donnelly. Your thoughts here for Jamie.
Very true, all of that. I mean, to give one example, with the argument during the Voice debate that we stole the land, that it was genocide, I mean, it staggered me. It's like original sin. Every generation, succeeding generation in Australia is guilty. I mean, my daughter, even though she's 40 years old, she's guilty, even though she was never there. My wife, who came out from England, immigrated, she's guilty. So one of these strange things, I mean, whether it's climate alarmism, gender theory, whatever it is, it's as though it's become a religion with all the downside, if you like. There's nothing uplifting or positive or beneficial or God-given, but it's a religion in a sense that it forces on young people this highly emotional, very unthinking commitment to something. They have their own saints, if you like, whether it goes back to Che Guevara or Ho Chi Minh or Lenin or Stalin. They have their own Bible, whether it's, the United Nations ICCP book on climate change, whether it's Ros Ward. It's as though, and I think it was Chesterton attributed with the quote, the problem is when people don't believe in nothing. The problem is when they don't believe in anything, they believe in nothing. Or I think it's the other way around. You might be able to help me.
If you believe in nothing, you'll fall for anything. I think that's the way that sort of saying goes. And look, just quickly on that, and while we've got Jamie here, and Jamie's thinking deeply about these things. If you don't believe anything, you'll fall for anything. Are we falling for anything right now in Australia around this, issues around, identity politics and the group think that comes around that? People getting into their own little bubble of, that's the only thing they're exposed to. Jamie, have you got anything just quickly further to add along those sorts of lines? Or
Yeah. Well, of course, not yourselves included in this, of course, but of course through your mainstream media outlets, there seems to be like a bit of a killing of information and what we get to hear, But just a quick thought I just wanted to add while I can actually talk to you guys was just some reading I was doing on the history of socialism and Marxism and all that type of thing. And one of the things about the perfect utopian society is you can create this where everybody just shares all the produce of the country and all this type of thing, and it's all fair. But the problem is we're dealing with something that's broken, sinful mankind that was broken at the fall. So therefore, socialism technically can't work. And it never will.
Jamie, I think you're making a really powerful point there too. Fallen humanity isn't going to always have everybody else's best interests at heart. A quick response, and we'll let Jamie go, but a quick response from you, Kevin.
I taught English for many years in school, and one of the favourite novels or stories was Animal Farm. And to reinforce that point, it started off that, all animals are equal. If you're walking on two legs, i.e. man, you're the problem. It ends up with the pigs living in the farmer's house walking on two legs. So socialism has always promised a worldly utopia. But as a Catholic, I understand that is not possible. The fact is we are, I think it was Milton talks about half to rise and half to fall, that we're not perfect, even though we have that sense of godliness. So the problem with communism, it promises, it's never delivered. I mean, the millions and millions of people starved, killed, whether it was Russia, China, it doesn't matter. It's always failed.
Jamie, I want to thank you for your call, and our talkback line open 1800 316 316. I want to ask you, Kevin, because there's a lot of things that might group us into various identities, and we get caught up in a lot of those things. A lot of the issues, particularly for young people, are being led by celebrities. I wonder if you've got any thoughts here around celebrities and the way their influence is perhaps over amplified in our society.
Well, when I grew up, it was relatively straightforward. You know, we had black and white TV, and I think there were started off with 2 or 3 channels all those years ago. And my brother and I, we used to go to the Saturday matinee where we'd see westerns and, things. There were heroes then, but in many ways they were good heroes. They fought for what was right. They fought for justice. They fought for helping others. And in a sense, when I grew up, we had mentors and heroes that we looked up to. Increasingly with social networking sites, with the virtual world, a lot of young people, and it's been happening for years, are caught up with celebrities, people who often have thousands and thousands of young people viewing them. There's no control over that in the sense that parents often aren't aware of what's going on. And a lot of these people that are on in the virtual world are not good people. I mean, they're more consumed with aggrandising their own benefits. They're often very self-seeking. They're often very more concerned about getting likes rather than doing anything reasonable or balanced. So there is a real danger here. The other thing is, when I taught literature, the books that we studied, the poems, the plays, the stories, we made sure that they were beneficial, that they were affirming something worthwhile. And there's an American, Bruno Bettelheim, talks about the need to give young people, children in particular, a sense of stories from the Bible, fables, whether it's Aesop's fables, whether it's Brothers Grimm, the Iliad, the Odyssey, coming up to C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. All of that literature is positive and life-affirming, and it introduces children to the complexity of life and how difficult it is. That's all been turned on its head. A lot of what children are now studying in school is very bleak. It's about social breakdown. It's about gender transitioning. It's about white guilt. So one of the things that troubles me, and parents have to be aware of this, always look at what is happening at your child's school. What are they teaching in history or social studies? and what are they teaching in English?
And being aware of what we were talking about a little earlier, that there are a lot of communities now where parents are getting together and talking about new ways they can do education in their own community, and leading to something which has started off in various places around the world, looks like an education revolution. Let's take one more call. Alex is in Melbourne. Hello, Alex. Welcome along.
Oh, hello, Neil. Is it Kevin or Keith?
Kevin.
Oh,
Kevin's our
yes.
guest.
Oh, yes. I was just thinking about the curriculum, the study of religion. I think that's not accurate because, I mean, when you read, "For grace you are saved through faith, and that not of yourself, it is the gift of God." There's no sort of works there or law there. It's actually it's just make the subject called knowledge of God or something like that, because when religion, it just gives you an idea. Oh, here we go, law and servitude and do this and do that, But for a person to be starting to get interested in, what's this going to be about? What sort of God is this and all this? Just the name of the subject, I think,
You know, what I sometimes say, Alex, is that of course we are saved by grace, but you can't govern a nation by grace. You have to have laws, and it's laws that actually shape our values and therefore our culture. A thought or two here from Kevin. Kevin, your thoughts here for Alex.
One of the things I did a couple of years ago was to look at all the state and territory legislation for government schools. And all of them say it's very important that religion is taught. Now, some of them say comparative religion. So if you're talking about the great religions of the world, whether it's Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or Christianity or whatever it might be. Others say that schools and parents should be able to decide what happens in the classroom. There is an opportunity there to teach religion, and it's a great shame that many schools don't take that up. But I come back to the national curriculum and the state and territory equivalent documents. There must be more done to affirm what we call Western culture, Western civilization. Many young people are strangers in their own land. They have no concept, no knowledge, no appreciation of what it is underpinning and nourishing our institutions and way of life. They're taught, cultural relativism, that all cultures are equal, this idea of multicultural, which I think is ridiculous. And they're also taught that each child, it's subjective. You can own your truth. Again, that's ridiculous. There is the one true God and God's word. We can't deny that. It's something that is that we should be teaching our young children.
I want to thank Alex in Melbourne for his call, and time has run out. And you might be thinking, how do I get an in a nutshell idea of what is so much the value of our Western civilization and how Australia is shaped by those influences? You might want to get a hold of Kevin's latest book. Now, Kevin is one of Australia's leading conservative public intellectuals. It's not the first book that he's written along these sorts of lines. The book we're talking about today is called The Culture of Freedom, Defending the West, and you can get a hold of it at Kevin's website, kevindonnelly.com.au. Kevin's written a whole bunch of books. Let me just list a few of those. He's the editor of the book Cancel Culture and the Left's Long March. Christianity is Good for Us, Why Faith Matters. Australia's Education Revolution, How Kevin Rudd won and lost the education wars. That one back in 2009. Why Our Schools Are Failing. Another one called Dumbing Down, and How Political Correctness is Destroying Education. There's a lot to glean from our guest today, Dr Kevin Donnelly, and you can access those books, including the one we're talking about today, The Culture of Freedom, Defending the West, when you go to kevindonnelly.com.au. Kevin, I hope I got all the details right there. I want to say thank you so much for taking some time giving up your precious time to talk to listeners today and to share your heart and your understanding and your knowledge of who we are as Australians and what shaped us to be a good people with a great nation. So thank you so much for joining us today on 2020.
My pleasure.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.